A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Now a man was ill, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with perfumed oil and dried his feet with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "Master, the one you love is ill." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained 2 days in that place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you want to go back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light in this world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." He said this, and then he told them, "Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I am going to awaken him." So the disciples said to him, "Master, if he is asleep, he will be saved." But Jesus was talking about his death, while they thought he meant ordinary sleep. So then Jesus said to them clearly, "Lazarus has died, and I am glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him." So Thomas, called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go to die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, only about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." When she said this, she went and called her sister Mary secretly and said, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." As soon as she heard this, she rose quickly and went to him. For Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still where Martha had met him. So when the Jews who were with her in the house, comforting her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, presuming that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died?" So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, "Lord, by now there will be a stench, for he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Now many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done began to believe in him. The gospel of the Lord. Back in 2001, right after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, some of us remember that the following week, as we were all trying to come to grips with the horror of what had happened, the president declared a national day of prayer, inviting people across the country to pray to God in their own way or their own faith tradition. The news reports were doing a lot of person-on-the-street interviews at that time, and I remember seeing an interview with a young woman on a sidewalk in New York, which of course was dealing with the awful aftermath of the World Trade Center attack. Asked what she thought about the National Day of Prayer, she replied, "Pray to who? What kind of a God would allow something like this to happen?" We are now living in the unfolding disaster of what may well turn out to be among the most devastating pandemics in modern history. Every day, the news just keeps getting worse, and we're clearly nowhere near even the peak of the epidemic. In some places, the number of new cases and of deaths is doubling every 2 or 3 days. In some countries, we see that there simply aren't enough hospital beds and doctors and nurses to take care of all the sick patients. That's already beginning in some parts of the United States right now and may happen here in Kentucky very soon. And this is not just a bunch of cold statistics. Real people are really suffering and dying. In a single family in New Jersey, 4 people died from coronavirus and 5 others are in the hospital. In a single nursing home in Washington State, 19 of the 55 patients living there died of coronavirus in just 1 week. One of the youngest victims here in the United States died of the disease last week at the age of 34, just 2 weeks after a happy vacation in Florida with his family. The world has seen disease epidemics like this, and some even worse, for all of human history. And in every age, people living through those disasters like we are today ask the same question. In a world of disease and suffering and death, where is God? I suppose the young woman I mentioned earlier who asked what kind of a God would allow this to happen, that woman is in all of us. At its worst, it can be the pride of demanding that God answer our questions. We may be tempted to judge God, to require God to explain himself to us while we decide whether his explanation satisfies us. That kind of pride can be a trap in which we put God on trial and we find God guilty. But it's not really that simple. We can't just say God is God and we mustn't ask him any questions. Every father who has heard a child ask, "Daddy, why does it hurt so much when you take me to the doctor?" Every mother who has heard a crying child ask, "Mommy, why did my puppy have to die?" Every parent who has listened when their suffering children ask questions knows that the children deserve an answer. In the gospel today, God answers our question. It's not a coincidence that this gospel reading comes in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, because every generation, every society, every person has asked God the same question. And today, God answers our question. The answer was so small that perhaps you missed it in this relatively long gospel with all the drama of Lazarus being raised from the dead. So let me read it to you again, one more time. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. There it is. One of the shortest verses in the entire Bible. Just 3 words. John chapter 11, verse 35. And Jesus wept. Mary is weeping. Martha is weeping. All the people who were with him were weeping. And Jesus, seeing their grief, their agony, their suffering and weeping, Jesus weeps too. That's the kind of God we have, a God who weeps, a God who sees our tears of pain and confusion and frustration and suffering and shares our tears. Not a God who is passive and serene and beyond suffering, not a God who insults our intelligence by telling us that suffering isn't real, isn't meaningful, and certainly not a God who gives us long-winded philosophical explanations of suffering. Instead, a God who sees our suffering and chooses to share it with us. And Jesus wept. We spend too much of our lives thinking that we're in charge, that hard work and intelligence and persistence and technology and science and a strong economy will keep us safe and secure. But then a pandemic happens, or an earthquake, or a war, or an economic collapse, and it becomes obvious that the idea that we are in control of our future was always an illusion. The mountains and the storms don't care. The sun and the stars don't care. The bacteria and the viruses don't care. And in our suffering, we turn to our God, and we know that he does care because Jesus wept. The way of life is not always the way of comfort and happiness and success. The way of life really is the way of the cross. But we don't walk that way of the cross alone. Our God knows the way of the cross because he walks the way of the cross with us. And Jesus wept. I said earlier that God answers our questions about suffering. It's the answer every parent gives to every child who is weeping at the death of a puppy or a grandfather or a brother. The parent is the answer. The mother or the father who holds the child tightly and feels the child's suffering and weeps too. God the Father answers us. But the answer is not just an answer. The answer is a person. The answer is the answerer. Jesus himself is the answer to our question. Jesus, the God who weeps. That day in Judea, Jesus told Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And he raised Lazarus, his beloved friend who had been dead for 4 days, to show that he could do exactly what he promised. And I believe his promise. I believe that pandemics and wars and economic collapse and natural disasters are not the end. I believe that Jesus will raise every one of us out of those catastrophes exactly as he promised. But I don't believe it because I read it in a heavy Bible beautifully bound in black leather, or because my priest or my teacher told it to me, or even because the catechism says it. I believe it because Jesus wept. Amen.